A lot of things can define Washington's season. Let's get into the numbers.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back in to another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He's the site editor with Athlon Sports Inside the Huskies. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen today, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And this episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. Terms and conditions apply. So, Lars, we want to have some fun and just dive into some of the numbers a little bit. So we've been doing a lot of research and a lot of scouring just to find 10 numbers that we think are going to define the Washington Huskies season in one way or another. So let's just jump right into it. What's the first one you got?
So as we were talking off the record, I've been saying that way too much recently. Before the show, technically off the record. What exactly show prep, because we take this so seriously. One of the things that stood out to me when we were talking about guys that, because as we discussed that ad nauseum, the amount of guys that left this team either to the NFL or to transfers is insurmountable. So when you look at when the guys that brought in, Jonah Coleman really does bridge that gap that Dylan Johnson left, and in particular, the one area that stood out to me was yards after contact, and that's the one thing that Jonah Coleman, when you look at him. I told you he was Michael Turner-esque with the size and those gigantic gargantuan trunks for a leg, because he's so hard to tackle. And when you go to the Big Ten, you need those extra. It's 2nd and 5. Getting 5 is nice, but if you could get 15 and really, kind of start to push and put pressure on the defense, that I think to me is where everything starts. And not everything, because everything starts with the offensive line. But really for Washington to help out Will Rogers or Damon Williams, Jonah Coleman really getting those extra yards could be one of those things that when you look back at the end of the season, those are going to be what defines those 7, 8, 9 wins potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to take it a step further, as you mentioned the offensive line there very briefly, where that's something that really can help this young, new offensive line that certainly needs that time to gel and to mesh and to work together. And having a guy who, if you're going to let up, at a certain point, there are going to be some free rushers and there are going to be guys in the backfield, and having somebody who's strong and slippery and can break out of some of those, just that contact in the backfield and turn that into maybe a 3-yard gain where it doesn't look like a lot, but when it looks like you're getting stopped for a 1 or 2 yard loss, and then it turns into a 3-yard gain, that's a really big difference. It's a 5-yard difference, really, if you want to just get into the numbers that much. So I think that's a really, really nice one. And, when combined with Cam Davis, this really is an exciting running backs duo that obviously it's not going to get talked about a whole bunch with Cam Davis missing all of last season with an injury, but it really could be one of the better ones in the Big Ten in 2024. So Lars, what's the next one you got?
So I'm just going to kind of transition in that same vein to a scheme fit in terms of when you look at what the offensive line did at Arizona. None of those guys came with Jedd Fisch and Brennan Carroll to Washington. But I think when you look at the scheme setup, it really does allow some of these transfers to come in and just naturally be a fit in this pro-style offense. And I think that, to me, it's not necessarily a stat, but it's when you can have a cohesive offensive line that it really gets back to what we saw last season, where you look at how much of a difference the offensive line made. Arizona, I believe, allowed 6 sacks, I think, 4 or 5, 6 sacks in 22. And then you look at 23, the exact same thing happened, where it was, I think, right around that same number. And so when you look at keeping that number low, this is what the offense is predicated on. Get the ball out quickly, get the talent in the skill position, so that way you can avoid taking those negative losses. And so whoever ends up being the starter on the offensive line, the two things to consider, and this is why I mentioned it, none of them either have true experience and the ones that do, like D'Angelo Titiali, has done pretty well. So I think the combination of those two should allow for those sack numbers to remain relatively low, especially when you pair it with either Williams or Rogers, because both of those guys in different ways can get the ball out quickly.
Sure. So I'll give you a number there. And for better or for worse, the number is 0. And it's Power 5 starts. That's That's something that you're going to have to hang your hat on at some point, where there is talent, where we like what Gardner Millar can do. We like what we saw out of Drew Party and D'Angelo Tutti, as you said. There are guys that certainly could. Actually, no, sorry, the number is 2, because Enoch Vamahai has 2 Power 5 starts, and this is something where, I left it out there originally because he's not guaranteed a spot. Yeah, you'd like to see that, and that's somebody with experience, but the numbers didn't necessarily back it up at the highest level, where he did play at Ohio State and played a lot in the Cotton Bowl against Missouri and didn't necessarily play very well. But it's something where that's really, as you said, that's going to be a really, really big point. And if the scheme does translate, and if they do figure out ways to just make it work, that's going to be huge for Will Rogers.
Exactly. And when you think about what the type of quarterback Will Rogers is, he's not a guy who's going to hold on to the ball long, but we did see at times in the spring where he, in a way, almost like, and this is a very severe example, but Penix-esque, where he already knew where he wanted to go to the ball. If that isn't open, he might actually be forced to hold on to the ball more, and he's not as good of a runner as Damon is. So having an experienced quarterback, and we mentioned it last week on the show, should help that offensive line get more cohesive early on. Because, as you said, there is basically, to be fair, yes, there is 2, but there's really nobody actually with true starting experience for an entire season, proven coming in saying, hey, this is a plug. Drew Party is, but that was at the Mountain West level. And no disrespect to the Mountain West, similar to where you can say the same thing about the FCS guys coming in, where it's, hey, like D'Angelo Tutti, 28 starts, 32 games at Portland State, look good. But how does that look when you're going up against Big Ten defensive linemen and you have, JT Tuimoloau opposing you? It's a lot different beast than you have some undersized guy in the FCS level. And it's, again, no disrespect, but just to be transparent and honest, that's the problem, and that's where everything's going to hang. Is if the offensive line can hold up, then you have a chance. If it does take a little bit more, and some of those starters, some of those guys that we project to be starters, they're rotating guys 2-3 through those first 2 or 3 games, then that's a little more of a cause for concern. So the next number for me, and it's an important one, just as we're talking about the offensive line, is on the other side of the ball with the defensive line. You have a couple of guys where Zach Durfee had over double-digit sacks at Sioux Falls, and the guys that they brought in, Isaiah Ward and Russell Davis, combined for, I believe, 8 sacks. So there's sack potential there. Lance Holtzclaw had 1. Javon Parker had 1. There's a bunch of guys who have either 1 or 2, but no true guys have a couple in terms of significant numbers year in and year out. But this scheme just really screams there's a lot more left on the bone. And so I think those sack numbers, to me, could be doubled for all 3 of those guys.
Okay. No, I like where you're going with this a lot, where, Durfee is obviously the name that, you and I have been talking about. And I know all of Husky Nation really wants to see Zach Durfee get going after just, what 2023 was. And he does have the potential. We've seen it at practice. We've seen what he's able to do. And now just the question is, how is it going to play in the scheme, and how is it going to translate? And another guy along the same vein that, you didn't mention, but it's certainly somebody we need to talk about, is Sebastian Valdez, where he put up some nice numbers at Montana State, but much like we're talking about with the offensive line, it's at a lower level. And I really like Sebastian Valdez. Some of the guys were saying, oh, this is the strongest player on the team. He's really, really talented, really powerful. We love what he can do. But it just needs to translate. And if it does, he could certainly be a huge acquisition for Steve Belichick and Jace Kafusi and this entire defensive staff. But it's just a matter of finding a way to make it translate. And Lars, we're going to keep jumping into the numbers after a quick break. Right after a message from our good friends over at LinkedIn, because when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free, because LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In any given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. You can hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. That's why 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockdowncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockdowncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Lars, let's keep it rolling.
So what's one position or one stat that we were surprised by a little bit last season? For me, it was interceptions.
Okay. Yeah.
And as I was looking at the numbers, Washington led the Pac-12 with 16 interceptions last year. Arizona, middle of the conference, had 9. The problem and the reason why I bring this up is you get Ephesians Prysock from Arizona, but beyond that, it's a lot of guys who do have experience. Like we talk about Elijah Jackson, Thaddeus Dixon. Somebody else in that room has got to match EP not even match EP, but really have to force the cause. And this is the carryover from the sack conversation that we had in the last segment. Those sacks need to force turnovers. So getting that pressure leads to interceptions. And if Washington get 13, 14, 15 interceptions, then you're in a good position. Whether if the sack numbers don't come, the interception numbers have to come. And so when you look at Arizona's defense under Johnny Hanson last year, it didn't necessarily force as many as we might have thought. Now, that being said, you could also say that, well, they didn't throw to guys, or, Sicario is getting PBUs but not interceptions. That, to me, these are all the little details that end up separating a 6-7-8 win team or 6-7 win team to an 8-9 win team. If you can get the PDs and get a guy off the field, that's one thing.
Yeah.
If you can force those interceptions, to me, that's where it really matters.
So I'm going to just kind of transition this one into the next number here, where I just have it as a question mark because it plays exactly into the last two things that we just talked about, and it's pressures, where that's a number that I'm going to be really, really curious by at the end of the season, where, last 2 years, Bralen Trice has led not just the conference, but the nation in pressures. That's a guy that's no longer here. We know that. We know that we're replacing the entire defensive line basically everywhere else. But that's just a number that I'm going to be really, really curious to look at the end of the season, where it's just like we talked about with the edge rushers just a minute ago. And the sacks are great, but we were so high on Bralen Trice because it wasn't just the sacks. It was constantly just recording pressures, 146 over 2 seasons. And that's something that when I look at, this group, I see a bunch of guys that I don't want to say can do that, but can just get into the backfield and can apply pressure. And that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day is, can you find a way to just apply pressure, move quarterbacks off their spot? And as it plays into the interceptions, this is not a very strong group of quarterbacks in the Big Ten. It's not. Let's call a spade here. Where, just to bring up an example of somebody they're going to play, where Drew Aller is somebody who's got all the physical tools in the world. He's got all the talent in the world. I love what Drew Aller can be, but he's not there yet. And that's the kind of guy where if you move him off the spot and you force him to make some tough throws down the field with the way this defense is going to be coached and with just some of the guys that are in the room, you can force him into a couple interceptions. You can force some of these other guys, whoever it might be, you can find a way to create those turnovers. And it all starts up front with finding a way to apply pressure.
Yeah, it's worth noting, to your point about Bralen Trice, no 2 Arizona players had as many pressures as Bralen Trice did by himself. Now, to be fair, that's also, you can pretty much say that about any 2 defensive linemen in college football last season because that's how dominant Bralen Trice was. But with that being said, and this kind of all ties together, there's so many different bodies on that edge defensive line position. I'm not expecting a Bralen Trice, even Zach Durfee. I'm not expecting a Bralen Trice-esque performance from Zach Durfee, just because there's so many different guys. There's so many different ways they can get pressure. To me, when you look at Arizona's defense, you mentioned the pressures. Taylor Upshaw, Jacob Manu, and Isaiah Ward all had over 30 pressures. And then you have 8 guys with about 10 to 20 pressures, which tells me that the scheme, and now it's going to be a little bit different with Steve Belichick, but the scheme is predicated upon different body types doing different things, not necessarily saying, hey, you're the guy. You're our Bralen Trice. Zach, you're our Bralen Trice this year. We need 12 to 15 sacks. Well, that's not realistic. Now, if he does that, more power to him. But I don't think necessarily that's a fair expectation. With that being said, it becomes leaning on those other guys that we mentioned, the Lance Holtzclaws, Isaiah Ward. And there's how many times did we see Isaiah Ward line up in about 4 or 5 different positions this spring? There's so much versatility. I'm not worried about not having one main guy because you have about half a dozen to a dozen guys who actually can record 2 or 3 sacks by themselves.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think is really, really important, where I like where you're going with this. And, this is going to be me just, taking this into a conversation about Steve Belichick's scheme as I love to do. And I'm just really curious to see where, I know this is all about the numbers and we're having fun just like getting into some of those, but I can't do that for one quick second here because I'm just curious to see where these pressures are going to come from and what it's going to look like. Where, when we talked to Daddy Sticks in the spring, he talked about playing a lot of cover zero, where what that looks like. What cover zero pressures look like, where it's just bringing bodies down to the line of scrimmage and just walking a bunch of guys up and blitzing from anywhere and everywhere. That's not what Steve Belichick likes to do. That's just not what the Bill Belichick defense is predicated on. It's predicated on giving you different looks and having guys show one thing and do another, and just being able to do a little bit of everything where, you're going to see a guy that looks like he's getting ready to drop into coverage as a strong safety that's, lined up basically as an inside linebacker, but he's going to come bring pressure. And then the middle linebacker in that spot is going to drop out. The middle linebacker is going to come off the edge, where there are a whole lot of different things that it can be. And I'm really curious to see how that all plays out. And I think we're going to see more of that when we get into fall camp, where a lot of it in the defense for the defense during the spring period was just learning and adjusting and just getting into the flow of all these different things. And by the end of fall camp, it's going to be a full go in terms of all the different things that the defensive staff is going to want to do. So Lars, what's the next number you got for us?
So the other one that this is kind of going to be a segue here is the kick return, punt return yards, where we saw last season that was hit or miss in a way. And then the number that gets to me is, can you get a special teams touchdown? We saw Odunze do it against Cal. If you can get three special teams touchdowns, that right there should at least get you 2 wins.
Okay. I see where you're going with this. I like this. And I want to use this to talk about a guy who I'm so excited to watch in fall camp. I know we still got probably about 2 months before we see him, but Jordan Washington, what is your plan with that guy? And I know that sounds weird to say it like that, but I mean it as the highest possible compliment. It's, how are you going to get this dude on the field? How quickly are you going to do it? And can you do it right now? Because I love watching his tape so much. And for anybody who hasn't out there that just enjoys watching the high school recruiting process play out, watching some of these guys, go watch Jordan Washington's film immediately. Because if I had to put a number on him, I would say 1. Because it takes him 1 step to just automatically be at his top speed. That's how quickly this guy accelerates. And just, if you want to use him as a kick returner, if you want to use him as a punt returner, I think it could turn into some good things, where I don't want to make any comparisons to John Ross or Dante Pettis, but that was the last time especially watching John Ross return kicks in 2016, watching Dante Pettis return punts for his entire Husky career. That was the last time I felt like there was a consistent threat to score back there. And I don't mean that as any disrespect to when we saw Odunze score a touchdown back there. I don't mean that as any disrespect towards any of those guys, but it was just a different sort of threat, where I remember watching Odunze back there. I felt the same way about watching Trent McDuffie do it for the early part of the 2021 season, where I was just please don't get hurt. Please don't get hurt. And I felt the same way about obviously watching John Ross and watching Dante Pettis, but it was just different. It sounds weird to say that, but that's the only way I could possibly put it, where when we were watching those guys back there, you knew Dante Pettis was going to find a hole, and you knew he was going to find a way to take it 10, 15, 20 yards if he wasn't breaking one off to the house. And you knew John Ross was going to find a way to get out around the edge and accelerate. And that's kind of how I feel about watching Jordan Washington, is that he can come in and do that right away.
He really can. And this isn't, I don't want to say it's a like for like comparison, but that first step, Devin Hester-esque. And when you think about it, because to be fair, I say that only because his punt return tape popped up a little bit a couple days ago in my timeline, and you cannot replicate a talent like Jordan Washington with the speed that he has and the vision that he showed it in high school. That's the perfect opportunity for a guy like him, where he might not see a ton of snaps at running back as a freshman. Yeah. Get him the ball any way you can. And I think this isn't a stat, it's a fact. Get your talent on the field. And we know Jedd's more than willing to get the freshman on the field. So I think in that regard, it's a perfect opportunity to maximize the great signing that you just had in 2024.
I agree. And that's kind of the way that I'm looking at it too, is he going to burn his red shirt? Is he not? There are a lot of different ways that you can take it, where Jedd's clearly not afraid to do that, but we'll see how that works out. And we'll keep going right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel, because summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more, and you can bet on it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP, Kristaps Porzingis, to who's going to hit one out of the park. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and like I said, Kristaps Porzingis, especially after the way he played in Game 1, as we're recording this before Game 2, you better check on those FanDuel odds now, because Kristaps just looks like he's out for revenge against this former team. And we'll have to see the Celtics doing well in the finals, or maybe that's just me. Lars, hit us with the next one.
So I'm going to go back to my special teams well here. And then I'm going to ask you another question. Who led the Pac-12 in scoring last season?
Grady Gross.
Who was second?
Oh, was it USC?
It's Tyler Lute at Arizona.
Oh, was it?
So,
I did not know that.
And exactly. And so one of the things that, and I did this out for Athlon Sports on my countdown, was Grady was money. And now you have a scholarship long snapper coming in to replace the scholarship long snapper, which will also have a story on Kevin Warshak coming on Athlon Sports this coming week. But the one thing that you can't replicate, Grady Gross. And the 3 kicks that he did, or the 4 kicks that he didn't miss last season, one was blocked, and the other 2 that he missed did not hurt Washington. And I think you cannot, when you have one of the, I believe the only other person in the Big Ten who scored more than Grady Gross last season was Blake Corum. So Grady Gross would have led the Big Ten in scoring last season too. And that's something to consider when think about it. He was a walk-on last year. So for me, this is a bit of a stat. But I'll put the number here. If Grady can go 85 to 90% from his kicks, perfect.
I've got 2 numbers here for you. The first one is number 9, because that gentleman is no longer around. And that's something that certainly plays a factor in that. I mean, we miss Mike every day, but that certainly plays a factor in this. And I'm not saying this to push back on anything you said, but that's something you need to factor into this. And I think that obviously was a huge help, where Grady went 63 for 63 on extra points. That's a whole lot of touchdowns, where I like Jedd's scheme. I like what it can be. I don't know if they're scoring 63 touchdowns this year. And, there are more than that, because there are a couple of 2-point conversions in there as well. But that's something that certainly needs to be factored into this. And then on top of that, the other number that I have for Grady is 47. Grady's longest kick last year was 47. That's good distance for a college kicker. It is. But I have some questions, and mainly because we haven't seen it, about his range from 50 plus. And I think that that's something that could become very, very important in 2024, when the more we look at this, and we talked about the offensive line, we talked about what could happen if the offensive line doesn't gel, and if a lot of these drives all of a sudden they stall because of a sack, or because of a stop run that loses 4 or 5 yards. If some of these things come to light, and it's, let's just say, a 53 yard attempt, are you going to trot Grady out there? And I'm not saying this in any way to be negative, because it's a legitimate question that I have. Are you going to trot Grady out there, or are you going to try to pin him deep? Either option I can't argue with, because we haven't seen it on the field this fall yet. But that's something that really needs to be answered, is, are you going to rely on Grady Gross from 50 plus yards this year?
So the answer to your question is a 66% chance. No. And the reason why that 66% is they went for it. They converted 66% of 4th down attempts in Arizona. Jedd Fisch only went for it 15 times, but the clip was 10 for 15. They did not, probably one of the good clip. So, but that answers your question in 2 parts. They attempted one of the more few 4th down attempts in the Pac-12 last season, but their conversion rate was the second highest, behind only Oregon, and you will not believe who tied Arizona in their 4th down conversion rate. Colorado. But with that,
that's a different story.
Right. But with that, but the reason why I bring that up is because Colorado attempted it the exact same amount of times. So in theory, will they pin him or punt him? I think Jedd's going to be more adept at going for it, depending on where they are in the field.
Okay.
If you're at the 50 and it's 4th and 3, I would not be surprised earlier in games if Jedd goes for it more, because when you look at the talent that they have, all the horses that this offense has, and if you only need 3 or 4 yards, you're better off doing it that way.
So I see where you're going with that, but let's talk about it this way. It's late in the game and you kind of need it. Like that's kind of the other way I wanted to make sure we took this is, are you still going to, try to go for it there when there's, let's just say, a minute 50 on the clock? Like, is that what you want to do and you're down 1, or do you want to take the points? And again, it's a fair question to have. And I really like those numbers you brought up, but it's something we won't be able to see this fall until, and there are a lot of different things to consider here, but it all just kind of goes into what Jedd's going to be as a game manager. Lars, got any other numbers for us? Let's keep going here.
Ooh. So the one that intrigues me the most is the second target. Who gets the second most targets? Because when you looked at Arizona and Washington, the two schools in the Pac-12 had more targets than anybody. The other thing that intrigues me is how do you also let me get this number. 30.
Okay.
The minimum number, the most targets for a running back should have this year. When you look at Jonah Coleman, you look at Cam Davis, because not Marcellus Wiley, Michael Wiley, sorry. Yeah. Had 34 targets last season out of the backfield. So not a ton of targets, but when you look at what this offense does, to me, Jonah Coleman fits that perfectly. And if not, you have Cam Davis, you have Adam Muhammad, Jordan Washington, even Daniel Ngata. Daniel Ngata, to me, I think might actually fill that role perfectly. But to me, you can have all the receiver horses that you want. It's getting those underneath and swing routes in that really we saw this spring Jedd seems to be wanting to employ.
Yeah, it's just part of the whole quick passing game, which all comes back to the offensive line. And it all kind of goes hand in hand where, if you want to try to hit Denzel Boston or Jeremiah Hunter down the field, that's great. You love to see that. But who are you going to look for underneath? So I'm glad you mentioned that, because you can also look at tight ends, where a number that I wanted to bring to the table in that same light is 14. So that's somebody catches Kaliki Latu had last year. And on something where we know Quentin Moore is going to become a bigger part of this offense. I'm curious to see what those numbers are going to be. But I wanted to go with the second string tight end because Quentin Moore is also just such a talented blocker that I don't know how they're going to want to deploy both of those guys. And I feel like Kaliki Latu has all the talent and all the frame like that needed to be a really nice receiver in this offense, whether it be just, as a third down security blanket, whatever it is you want him to be. But he hasn't shown it at a super high level just yet. And that's not his fault. He got hurt last year at Nevada, and he had to play at Cal for the previous 2 years. And, the quarterback play there hasn't been overly stellar. So you kind of just have to take it for what it is. And I like what Jordan Paopao can do. We both know that he's an excellent developer of talent. So I'm just really curious to see how they utilize him moving forward, where you're right. The running backs are certainly going to be involved, but when we saw all the concepts that they like to run this spring, a lot of it does involve a tight end. We saw what Tanner McLaughlin did at Arizona last year. And I know that's a point we keep coming back to, but it just means they're going to want to get one of these guys involved this year. And I lean a little bit more towards Kaliki Latu in terms of what I feel he can provide, where I like Quentin Moore a lot, but we've kind of seen what he can be at a ceiling. And I don't know if we've seen Kaliki Latu reach that just yet.
So it's interesting that I'm glad you mentioned the tight ends, because I'll give you a number. 6. The number of targets a non-Tanner McLaughlin tight end had at Arizona last year. Okay. Now, to be fair, the other side of that coin is you had Jacob Cowan, Tadaro McMillan, you had the who's who were receivers not at Washington to offset that. With Latu and Decker DeGraff, as we mentioned, I think there's more potential for those targets to increase. But to your point, somebody else is going to have to emerge in that room, because, Quentin Moore can get the red zone targets, but we even saw Josh Cuevas and Devin Culp last season. You need a second tight end in this offense helping on that regard. Now, will you see 2 tight end sets? Maybe not. Probably not. maybe a couple, but not a ton. But having that second threat, if you use Quentin as a blocker, can Devin flex out or can Kaliki Latu flex out? That's where I'm going to be intrigued.
I like that a lot. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Onvidares for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. And keep in mind, we are still in our off-season schedule, so we will be updating the show 3 times a week. The best way to make sure you keep up to date on all our latest shows, make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel. As I said, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we'll be dropping bonus content with breaking news, all that sort of stuff, whenever there might be a commitment or anything like that. So make sure you like, comment, subscribe, do all those things. If you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you on Wednesday.